Now, today we'll see 133 Catholic cardinals shut inside the Sistine Chapel to vote on who will be the next pontiff.
What a gorgeous place to be shut into. To be fair, here to peel back the Conclave's curtain is Jayne Tobin, native content editor with DMG Media, and Dr. Jacob Erikson, assistant professor of theological ethics in Trinity College. Is this your World Cup, Jacob? Are you like, this is it?
I'm having a great week, yeah.
I am ready to go. Let's go. Because we were talking to Richard earlier on about the mood, and he was like, listen, the morning is over. God rest him. Pope Francis said a great thing, but now it's time to move forward. So let's talk about this voting system. Jacob, it's the oldest voting system in the world. It hasn't changed.
Yeah, I mean, it's often noted as the oldest voting system, as the sort of the continuous voting for a head of state. It hasn't changed in some respects, but of course it has in others. And really the conclave system that we know today kind of emerged in the 11th century and moves into the 13th century. So the 11th century is when it becomes cardinals who do the electing. 13th century is when you sort of get the moment where they say, no, you all have to lock in a room and make a decision.
Because obviously there had been corruption before that.
Well, you know, the question of how external factors make a vote linger and take a little bit longer. Okay. And so, you know, you had certain elections that took maybe 3 years nearly, and certain elections that took hours. And so, you know, locking everybody in a room to make a decision is a pretty old practice.
Okay, so because I was
let's do this officially.
Reading here, the longest conclave was almost 3 years. Back in 1268 to 71. Have there been many controversies leading into this one with 133 cardinals, the biggest ever?
Well, like, it's a funny thing. I think this was if I'm correct, the largest conclave, or
yes,
the most amount of cardinals ever been brought into the room to actually discuss it. It's only the cardinals who are under the age of 80 who are able to vote. There has been a few. Like, there was one guy who was who pulled out of the conclave because he was found guilty of financial irregularities and stuff like that.
Angelo Bucci.
That's the guy, Angelo Bucci. But I mean, there's all sorts. Like, I think this is the first time around I've noticed anyway, because this is the third conclave I've worked on. In the past, I was working in news and current affairs, so we were kind of concentrating on all the stats and stuff like that. But this time around, looking at the cardinals, getting to know them on social media, because they're all very active on social media, which is kind of wild. You know, you're kind of thinking, you know, there was one guy who posted on X on the way to file past St. Francis, or Pope Francis's body. And, you know, you kind of have this thing in your head that they're all very sombre and sort of like, I don't know, they're all on the bus having the crack and looks like...
Well, that's what Richard Chambers was talking about Tagle from Philippines. I mean, he loves his karaoke and he's big on TikTok.
This is, like, it's a bit wild. Like, it's the first time that I've really kind of gotten to know them as such. You know, I've never been able to pick them out of a lineup before. But now they're almost becoming celebrities.
So with all of these things that are happening, Jacob, let's go back to the history a little bit. Why does it happen in the Sistine? For anyone who's been in the Sistine Chapel, it's not big, and 133 of them in there for hours.
Yeah. I mean, the Sistine Chapel is really interesting. The first time it was held there was 1492, but Michelangelo hadn't finished the frescoes yet. So, but it really doesn't become standardized there until about 1878. There have only been 26 that have met in the Sistine Chapel. There are 3 reasons, probably. One is that it's the papal chapel, and so we have to think that there's an election happening in the context of worship, of prayer and discernment. So doing it in the midst of a chapel registers that. Image-wise, you have the frescoes of the creation of Adam above and the Last Judgment sort of peering down on the cardinals. This decision matters in the course of history. And then there's a practical reason, right, which is it's cramped a little bit, but you can fit all of them in and you can lock them down easy.
There's no moving. You are like, that's it. Yeah.
So how does the voting process work then?
Yeah, so the voting process, I mean, you have to put it in that context of prayer, right? So they begin 10 a.m., they go to Mass in St. Peter's, they move to the Pauline Chapel, they have a prayer service, they move into the Sistine Chapel. You have the Camerlengo, who's looking at the ways that you lock down everything, and then you have the Dean of Cardinals, who's doing the work on the inside, sort of making sure that
and that is Kevin Farrell,
Kevin Farrell is the Camerlengo,
from Drimna.
and then the Dean is...
And if anyone's thinking, he's Ray Fiennes in Conclave. There we go. That's who he is in Conclave. So he's doing all that stuff.
Okay, so there'll be mass, and then they go and each put. Do they write down the name, put it into a ballot box?
Yeah, so they get a ballot that says in Latin, I elect, and then they put down a name, put it into the, say a few words, put it into the chalice, and then a couple folks do the genuine counting from the inside. But there's this moment that everyone talked about is the dean says sort of extra omnes, everyone else out, right? And everyone who had been in there who wasn't a cardinal has to leave, and that's when the lockdown and that's when the votes happen.
Because I was wondering, I suppose we see, are they they're not talking inside there, because there's so many different languages involved. Is there an official language of the conclave? Is it Latin?
Yeah, the Latin is kind of a base language in some ways for the official processes.
Okay.
But I mean, you make a great point there that actually a lot of these cardinals don't know each other, right? And so the last few days and the conclave itself is them figuring out who each other are and listening to each other and figuring out what their pastoral concerns and local concerns are and how do you bring that into a voting process.
I believe because they want to keep anonymity to the highest there as well, they even change their handwriting.
They change their handwriting. They can't discuss it. There's all these other little kind of things that they have, these safeguarding measures to make sure that there's no outside interference where, there's radio frequencies blocked from the Sistine Chapel. Obviously, they can't bring their phones in. They even check the food to make sure no messages are being slid in to the food that they're going to be eating and stuff like that.
I heard that we can't have pasta shells in the kitchen today because they used to use those to hide notes.
It's the thing, they check, I think it's there was a thing back in the day, I think it was in the 13th century or something like that, where they, there was a rule that they could only eat certain foods. It's not quite so strict now, but they do check what they're eating. There's an order of nuns who basically are going to be looking after the cardinals for the next few days, and they look after, with cooks and stuff like that, they look after the meals that have to be checked. Roast chickens can't go in without being
checked.
pulled apart.
Okay. These aren't, at 67, one of your man from the Philippines who's up there as, the Pagal from the Philippines, thank you. He's one of the youngest. They're not the sprightliest of chickens.
They said he's too young. They reckon he's maybe too young.
Should they bring in maybe cardinals meeting once a year so they all get to know each other and have a clue before something like this happens?
Well, it's a global church, right? And each context is quite different. Some of the cardinals do know each other. Some of Pierre Lynn, for instance, right, is that sort of central political figure, as Secretary of State, who knows a lot of those folks. It is kind of a central hub.
Yeah.
Some conversations happen, but again, like you said, they're sworn to not talk about it at threat of excommunication. So that kind of question of what kind of level of communication for the church is necessary, and how do you talk about reform, for instance, right now, which is what Pope Francis.
Well, this is it, because Pietro Parolin, he is the favourite, and he was kind of the right-hand man to Pope Francis as well. So he's definitely the favourite. But Pope Francis was very much an outsider, wasn't he? So do you think there could be an upset? I mean, what's the mood music around it?
The old statement is, right, he who goes in a pope comes out a cardinal. So the person who you think it's going to be rarely is. And Francis was an upset.
But Benedict was expected, though, wasn't he, before Francis?
Kind of. I didn't quite expect Benedict. Benedict had that kind of, he was a theologian before as Cardinal Ratzinger. He had that kind of sense of presence and traditionalism to him. But I remember huddling around a transistor radio when Benedict was announced, everybody being like, oh, okay, now we got to do that.
Transistor radio.
So we should expect a shock.
I think you can. The thing about all the speculation at the beginning is, right, everybody wants to be right. And so there will always be somebody at the end saying, yeah, I called it first.
Yes, of course. And now we've got the Fanta Papa that Richard was telling us about earlier on. Can we just ask you, we're waiting for the black smoke means that a pope hasn't been elected. White smoke means a pope has been elected. We've got the chimney that's going to come out of the Sistine Chapel. Once a pope is selected, we see the white smoke. What happens then, Jacob? Directly then?
Directly then, well, the white smoke, there's a bit of pyrotechnics involved. There's a sort of an electric charge that they hit so that it actually goes off at the right time, and so it is the white smoke and not something ambiguous.
Yeah.
The person who is elected is, everyone who was ushered out is ushered back in. They're asked, do you accept? And then at that moment, they're also asked, what is your name? What's your papal name going to be, right? And the chosen name of a pope says a lot about what their work is going to be. So when Francis was chosen, right, St. Francis of Assisi, known for ecology, known for economic poverty and humility, it sets the tone for a papacy. So you need to know right in that moment. Then they're ushered into this room, which is frequently called the room of weeping or the room of tears, where really kind of the magnitude of the whole thing kind of hits the person. And so a lot sort
out of your
of,
system,
and it's kind of just like a closet with a bunch of cassocks in it, or a bunch of cloths and stuff. So I just always imagine the moment, Pope is elected, them going, oh, now here we go.
Here we go.
Yeah. And then they're brought out to the balcony.
They pick their outfit as well, do they?
It's usually a white cassock, sort of that liturgically signals the kind of baptismal garment that some folks wear. So there's a return to that a little bit. But they're brought onto the balcony and Habemus Popem, we've got a pope. Here it is, and announced to the world in Latin, and then you figure out, wait, what name did they say?
Live streamed on TikTok, obviously, is what's going to happen.
Who do you think's going to win? Go on. Give us, as soon as we said someone's going to guess it, have you got it?
I'm not going to.
You're not going to put it out there.
Jacob!
I mean, in terms of theology and the tradition, who's going to win? Well, the priests and the cardinals will say it's the Holy Spirit ultimately that kind of comes in and chooses.
That was Sarah's answer. She was like the Holy Spirit. She was like, it's the Holy Spirit
I'd like
that
to see
wins.
one of the guys now who is quite active on social media, because I think that's in the last couple of weeks, especially even since Pope Francis was ill and stuff like that. There's been, as I said, you've gotten to know them a lot. Cardinal Tagley. I can never say that.
Yeah.
Tagley.
Cardinal Tagley. He's great crack. I'd love to see someone like that because I just think it's a little bit more human.
Listen, Sarah Jayne Tobin from DMG Media, thank you so much for joining us, and Dr. Jacob Erikson, School of Religion at Trinity.
Thanks a million.
Great to have you both.
So interesting. Thank you so much.